All right, buckle up for a deep dive into some seriously creepy stuff. You guys sent in 3 accounts, and let me tell you, even I got chills reading these.
Yeah, these are definitely some head scratchers.
We've got an ER nurse, a medical examiner, and a runner, all experiencing things that just don't add up. So today, we're looking for patterns, connections, anything that jumps out at you as we go through these stories. What do you think? Anything in particular you're looking for?
Well, what strikes me is the shared sense of dread in all these accounts. You know, like something is just slightly off kilter in the world. It really makes you think about the nature of reality.
Absolutely. Okay.
Before we get into the first story, please like, subscribe, and engage in the comments. Here goes the first story. I'm an ER nurse. Something strange is happening in my town, and I don't know what to do. First, I'm not really sure how to even start this post. I've never been someone that turns to an online group for medical questions. But because of what has been happening lately, I can't shake a nagging feeling that something is really off in my town and I needed to talk with someone about it. With a lot of hesitation, I finally confided to a close friend about all this, hoping they wouldn't think I was losing it. Thankfully, they listened and suggested I share what's going on here, so I'm going to give it a try. A quick disclaimer. As a nurse, I take patient privacy and confidentiality very seriously. Because of HIPAA regulations, I won't be using any real names, places, or other identifiable details. I've changed descriptions of patients, cases, and locations because of privacy rules. I want to share my experiences without crossing the lines for the trust and safety of my patients I take care of. So, if anything seems vague, it's because I'm being cautious. Better safe than sorry, as I don't want to jeopardize my career for this. Let me share a little about myself and my community first. As I mentioned above, I'm a nurse, and I've worked in the ER at Pine Haven Medical Center in Willow Ridge for over a decade. I love what I do. Being an ER nurse is not glamorous. As cliché as it sounds, I became a nurse to help people, and my job has let me do just that. Pine Haven is a small hospital in a small town. Most of my shifts are spent patching up fishing accidents, treating sprained ankles, or stitching up Friday night bar fight injuries. Nothing exciting like you'd see on a TV medical drama, but I find it rewarding. Willow Ridge is a small town where everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do. It's hidden away in the southern U.S., surrounded by thick woods and rolling countryside that seem to stretch on forever. We've got a little historic downtown with mom-and-pop diners, a hardware store, and a general store that's been here for as long as anyone here can remember. Our area lake is a big draw, especially for weekend fishermen and the occasional tourist, but honestly, most people just pass through our town without giving us much thought. We all joke about the idea that, if you're driving through and blink, you will probably miss our little community. One thing about Willow Ridge residents is that they have a really strong sense of privacy. For instance, people don't talk much about the woods. Let's just say they've always had a creepy reputation. I've always shrugged it off, but sometimes you can feel it. People joke that the Ridge has a story it doesn't want to share. I've always chalked any odd stories up to old wives' tales or local legends that have been passed down over the years. Every community has folk tales, and ours is no different. Back to why I came here to post. This past week, something happened that I just can't stop thinking about. Over the weekend, we had 3 patients come in, all with nearly identical injuries, deep scratches spiraling down their arms or backs. When I first talked with them, took their history and assessed their wounds, I thought maybe they'd been snagged by a thorn bush or maybe gotten into it with a stray cat. But here's the thing, all 3 of them told me that they didn't remember how they got the scratches, and their scratches were, for lack of a better word, just weird. One patient, an older guy I'll call Mr. Calloway, joked with me saying that the marks looked like some kind of weird symbol. He laughed it off, but I could tell he was really anxious about them. The second patient was a teenage girl whose parents brought her in because her scratches were bleeding too much. She was quiet, and barely looked up from her phone. The third was a young man who looked pale and shaken, like he hadn't slept in days. Outside of the weird scratches each of them talked about a weird smell. They described a sharp, rotten egg odor that seemed to follow them, even when they were nowhere near where they thought they may have got the scratches. None of us in the ER could smell anything, but the patients swore it was there, metallic, rotten, almost like something burning. The young man said it was so strong it made him nauseous. I don't know. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but 3 patients in 2 days? The same pattern of injuries and the same description of the smell? That doesn't feel random to me. I'm not jumping to conclusions here. I'm not the kind of person who believes in aliens, or whatever. I'm a nurse, and I like to think I'm a pretty grounded person. But I can't help feeling like I'm missing something, and it's starting to keep me up at night. Has anyone ever seen or heard of something like this? I don't know if I'm looking for answers or just trying to get it out of my head, but I'd really appreciate any thoughts. I took a snap of the wound to show the ER doctor that treated the young man and to upload to his medical record as part of my documentation. For some reason I forgot to delete it from my phone. I wanted to share the pic here but was not sure how. I did Google how to post it, and hopefully the link below will work. A link to the picture I took is in the description. View it and let me know what you think. Now for the second story. I'm performing an autopsy on a pregnant woman, and things keep getting stranger. I knew her. In all my years of work, I've developed a strange relationship with death. I see it as something purely physical. The body in front of me is just an organism who's stopped living. That's all that it is. And yet, it took me by surprise to have her on my table. I'd seen her around the hospital before, excited, glowing, talking about what her life would look from now on. She was a bit distracted sometimes, saying that great things were coming, but I didn't expect her to die right before giving birth. She was found drowned in her own home, with writings on her wrists and on the back of her neck, and she'd been laying in her bathtub for days before her neighbor found her. She had no husband, no relatives. They expected me to rule it as a suicide. I didn't believe that, since it made no sense. Why would she kill herself right before giving birth? Right before becoming a mother, a thing she'd been so excited about. I'd been called in the middle of the night to work on her. They said her body was already in a pretty fragile state, and I needed to be precise and fast before they could wrap this tragedy up. I won't weight you down with all the gory details. I'll just go over the process really fast, so that you'll get an idea of what I do. First came some of the paperwork and observations, along with the external examination and photographs. I didn't notice anything besides the obvious signs of drowning and damage done by the 3 days spent in the bathtub. Although, if I'm being honest, but that might have been just me, I thought that the skin surrounding the writing, wrists, neck, was lighter than the rest and harder. Next came the internal examination. I'd been plagued by a wave of sadness, not wanting to move on with the procedure, but I tensed up and kept on working. Again, the usual signs of drowning. I froze with the instruments in hand. I was the only one in the morgue, or, at least, the only one alive, and it might have been the lack of sleep or the general eerie atmosphere that was making me feel unsure of what I was seeing. There was no earthly way she could have made those carvings on her ribs. Tiny carvings of the same symbols. My throat was dry, which made me feel like I was choking on air, and suddenly the collar of my scrub felt too tight for me. It wasn't my imagination. Her ribs were covered in these carvings. Could it be some bone-eating bacteria? I knew it was pointless to even ask that question, because I knew it wasn't. I took out my phone to take a close-up of the ribs. I know that wasn't too professional, but I had no choice. The moment I took the picture, something clattered in the distance. I looked up to the door to the hallway. No one should be here. I took a sharp breath and carefully put my gloves back on, feeling the blood slowly drain from my face as I worked my way down to her amniotic sac. I was expecting to see something that would make my skin crawl, and I knew that no matter how hard I braced myself, it would still hit me hard. When I opened it, it was empty. There were no signs of a fetus. It was as if it had just disappeared, leaving her placenta and the umbilical cord behind intact. There was no baby there. I stepped back from her and took off my gloves. I rubbed my eyes. That had to be impossible. Her tummy had been perfectly round, and I'm pretty sure there would have been signs if she'd given birth before or after dying. It was inhumane. Unnatural. Everything indicating a pregnancy existed, all except for the baby. I carefully closed her up, trying not to think about the missing baby and the symbols, then filled the report. I wrote suicide on it. I wasn't 100% sure of that. I didn't need to be. They'd been clear with the instructions, just get it done. Fast. I creaked the door open and peered into the hallway. The clattering had come from the supply room, and I hadn't heard the door open or close, so what had done it was still there. I approached it slowly, holding my breath, as if I were afraid to make a sound. I placed my hand on the doorknob and twisted. Click. It was locked. On the inside. I knocked. "Hey," I whispered. "Is anyone there?" What followed was an unusual sound, something like someone sucking the air through their teeth. I looked back to the hallway, ending with the morgue. The door was swinging open. I couldn't remember if I'd closed it or not, and I didn't want to. I decided my job was finished there. I closed up and got into my car, then drove home in silence. I live alone, so me coming home at 3 a.m. would not disturb anyone. After doing my night routine and going to bed, I found myself twisting and turning, strange dreams pressing onto me, like the ones you have when you have a fever. I thought I heard a cry at one point, until I realized it had been my own. I opened my eyes after what seemed like minutes, to discover it was a little over 6 a.m. In the soft glow of the morning, my window had fogged up a bit, and I couldn't help but stare, perplexed, at the fresh print of a child's hand on and side of the glass. If you are loving listening to us so far, please subscribe, like and comment. Now for the final story. I was hunted on the canal trail near my home. I live in a safe town. They say it's great for raising kids, but what people mean is it's pretty boring. We do have one thing though. There's this amazing gravel trail that goes along a canal for miles and miles. For about 7 miles there's a lake on the other side, and you're rewarded with beautiful views of water on both sides of the canal. In the fall the leaves drift down onto the stagnant water of the canal, and the colors are unbelievable. In the winter you sometimes get this mist that rises from the water and envelopes the stark branches that hang over the trail like a skeletal canopy. It's almost magical when you're there alone, and the only sound is your breath and your heartbeat. Some people do get creeped out by the fog, but the seclusion has always been comfortable to me. It's only a problem if there's a flock of geese or something on the trail and there's no way to get around them. I only mention all this because it's important to understand that you can't really get off this trail once you're on it. In the winter the water is freezing and there are miles of forests on the canal side. So if you're on a run and you're halfway along the lake, you can't just bail out. There was this one incident when I was little though. Another kid, Riley, was playing along the path one afternoon and didn't come home. A few days later the police found his body deep in the woods across the canal. He had swum through the canal, wandered through the forest for a few miles, and curled up beneath a tree to die. His clothes were blocks of solid ice, frozen to his body. I have the image etched in my mind of his bike still being locked up at the trailhead when I walked down to look for him with everyone else. Except he was never gonna come back and get it, and nobody knew the combination to the lock. I didn't even know Riley that well, but that realization really set me off as a kid, and I cried myself to sleep for days. All these years later, that image still really gets to me. After that the town started closing the trail at night, but we eventually came to terms with it as a freak accident, and every kid knew not to go in the cold water. Though I always wondered why he so abruptly went into the woods like that. He was a smart kid and he was only half a mile from the trailhead. If you grew up in a town like mine, you probably forgot to look over your shoulder every once in a while. I know I did. On one cold December day, I pulled out of my parents' driveway even as the shadows lengthened and the sun started to dip behind the row of trees at the end of my street. I was pretty serious about cross-country back then. And with regionals coming up, there was no chance I was skipping my workout. I didn't think about the trail curfew, which I had ignored so many times anyways, and regardless I wasn't planning on taking a swim. When I got to the trailhead in the fading light, the parking area was already closed. But I parked off the road, hopped out of my car, and set off at a blistering pace along the narrow trail. I'd done a lot of runs along that trail. It was always very simple. I had so much familiarity with the trail, with the gentle curves and rolling of the gravel beneath my feet. I should have been on autopilot, as I had been every other time. But this time, I became keenly aware of the empty trail stretching behind and before me, the trees seeming to encroach from either side. The mist started to rise from the canal, but this time, it was anything but comfortable seclusion, and the trailhead started to fade away behind me as I pushed further ahead. Maybe it was because I had left my earbuds behind this time, and the silence was just a little more oppressive than usual. I checked my shoulder. What am I even looking for? The trail is empty. I turned back around and reminded myself that I was just being a chicken. The most important thing was to crush this workout. As I kept going, I started to feel more comfortable. The fog had started to thicken, but I could barely make out the moon above me, lighting my way forward. My breathing and heartbeat stabilized as the mile markers passed by one after another, my feet churning at the ground below me. I started to smile as I passed the midway point, just one more mile before I could start the journey back home, to the warmth of a home-cooked dinner. In the fog, things appeared slowly and then all at once. My nerves started to come back when I first noticed something in the mist. Nothing more than a shadow, still about 100 meters in front of me. My stride faltered, but at this point I still thought it was probably some stupid deer or another harmless jogger out for a late run. Just a few moments later, I was proven wrong. It wasn't a deer or another jogger. It was a man. Tall, hands in the pockets of his oversized coat, walking in my direction. He wasn't running or anything, but there was something deeply wrong with his movement. His stride was leisurely, but looked almost rehearsed. Like he was trying to act inconspicuous. My stomach started to turn and I could feel the intensifying chills running down my spine. He's probably just a guy out on a walk, I thought, the logical part of my brain straining to regain control against my rising panic. I pretended to check my watch, turned around, and started back the direction I came from. I surreptitiously checked my shoulder. Is he walking faster now? Holy shit, he definitely picked up the pace just now. The internal alarms became tornado sirens as I started panicking, my breath becoming ragged. No normal person would speed up like that. I was running fast now, and he wasn't, so he started to recede into the fog. For the first time, the black and freezing water lying on both sides of the trail was no longer just a beautiful view. It was a reminder that there is only one way out. This time, I didn't get into a rhythm. It was uncomfortable, but I was pretty sure that if I pushed hard, there was no chance he could catch up before I got back to the trailhead. There is only one way out. Forward. My unease rose even further. I had been nervous from the beginning, before this creepy dude had blocked me along the trail. What put me on edge like that? And then, at the 2-mile marker, the horrifying realization hit me all at once. There is only one way out. A fragment of memory, from the start of my run, exploded into focus. Yes, there was the uneasy glance over my shoulder, looking back towards my car. But this time there was also a faint beam of light, almost swallowed by the fog, barely visible as the trail fell away behind me. The faraway sound of an idling engine, cutting out, and then the silence. At the time I hadn't even noticed it. Was there someone behind me back there? For the second time, I stopped short. The adrenaline was pumping through my body. I was gulping in air in ragged bursts, and my heartbeat hammered against my ribcage. I couldn't see the trailhead from there. I couldn't see more than 50 meters down the trail in either direction, so it was hopeless. The fog was no longer comforting. In fact, I was now effectively blind. Behind me, the lake may as well have been an ocean stretching into the fog. The black water of the canal opened up in front of me, mirroring the thickly packed trees on the other side. Calm down. Control your breathing. At first, I couldn't hear anything over my own heartbeat. Only the shroud of silence in the fog. And then, barely audible, was a faint rhythmic tapping, or a scratching on the gravel. Footsteps. Coming from the direction of the trailhead. The blood turned to ice in my veins. And the steps were getting louder now. Not running. Deliberate. Leisurely. Sinister. Just like before. The fog was so thick, I wouldn't have been able to see someone until they were essentially on top of me. I was trapped. No way out. Except for Riley's way. At this point, I realized there was very little time before someone would appear on the trail in front of me. If they turned out to be harmless, it would have felt pretty stupid to do what I did next. But my paranoia was all-consuming by this point. I left my shoes on the side of the trail, took off my shirt, and braced myself. And then, I dove into the canal, the icy water rushing up to meet me. The shock as I hit the water was awful. It took all the breath out of my lungs. My entire skin burned on contact, stinging deeply. I had expected to get numb at some point, but it only got more painful. If I had gotten a muscle cramp, I would be dead. But somehow, after fighting through the viciously cold water, I clawed myself up the opposite bank. I was shivering uncontrollably. And I looked back across the canal. They were looking back at me. 2 men. Both tall. Standing next to each other, the darkness and fog almost enveloping them, but now only 40 feet separated us. If they're harmless, they'll call 911 right now and get me medical attention. I was still hoping. They just stood there, still and seemingly controlled. Heads slightly tilted. There was an robotic blankness there, behind their eyes, like you would see in a bad animation. But their faces twitched frantically, their expressions shifting from one incomprehensible emotion to another, as if there was a violent and unpredictable current tearing their minds apart from the inside. I was mesmerized, unable to tear my eyes away from theirs. Something inside them was deeply wrong, in a way I'll never be able to understand. I still see those twisting faces in my nightmares. Those broken, empty eyes staring out from the darkness. I've never seen anything like that again. And then, the waves of pain and adrenaline came rushing back, and I staggered backwards. I inhaled the icy air, fighting back to life, knowing beyond doubt that they could and would stand there all night to watch me freeze to death. Just like Riley. But now there was only one way out, through the miles of thick forest. I was pretty sure there was a county road on the other side, or maybe a farmhouse. I gathered the last of my strength, and forced my aching body to limp towards the tree-line. The downed branches tore at my feet, but quickly, I was swallowed by the forest and fog. Before disappearing entirely, I looked, one last time, over my shoulder at the other side of the canal. There was now only one man standing there. I don't know how long I was in the forest. I faded quickly even as I was pushing forward on my numb and rubbery legs. And every snapping branch, every rustling of the leaves against the wind became the sound of footsteps in pursuit. But I didn't look back again. The stinging cold was slowly replaced by a radiating warmth that was almost worse, since that meant I was going hypothermic. They taught us the symptoms of hypothermia after Riley died. And suddenly, there was the tree-line. The fog had cleared up at some point, and as I stumbled forward, I could see the moonlight on the open fields. There was a road, too, winding between the barren fields. I could feel my heart soaring as I pushed through the last few trees. Freedom. I was going to make it back home. Then I saw the car. It was parked beneath one of the tree breaks, and I almost hadn't noticed it at first. The lights and engine were off, but I could make out a figure hunched over the steering wheel. As if he were waiting for something. What was he waiting for? I watched for a while, but he was perfectly still, his head turned towards the opposite field. I breathed a sigh of relief. He hadn't seen me. I started retreating back into the shadows to stay out of sight. The headlights suddenly flickered on, illuminating the field in front of me. I was paralyzed, my chest tightening, hoping not to be spotted. The headlights started swinging around, in an agonizingly slow arc, until the trees around me were ablaze, and the piercing light blinded me. Shit. There was no way I hadn't been spotted now. I tried to find more energy, but my breathing was becoming shallower, my legs giving way beneath me as I pushed back into the trees. It felt like the trees were becoming even thicker, if anything, and I could no longer feel any of my extremities. I could see the disgusting blackness of frostbite consuming the flesh on my fingers, and had to fight down the bile rising in my throat. My vision was becoming blurry, and I finally knew I had nothing left to give. And the ground suddenly gave way beneath me. I spilled out of the trees into a roadside drainage ditch. As the darkness crept in, I heard the roar of an approaching engine. A tear was welling up in my eye as I imagined Riley's bike locked at the trailhead. Had this been what his last moments felt like? I felt the sensation of rough hands hoisting me off the icy ground, and then it all faded to black. The aftermath. I woke up at the hospital 2 days later. I was very lucky, the doctors said. If I hadn't been picked up by a local farmer on his way back from town, I would have died in that ditch by the side of the road. In any case, I lost 2 fingers and 4 toes to frostbite. Obviously, I didn't run in regionals, or ever again. But I hadn't been the only one to be out on the trail that night. It was one of my friends on the team, Gavin. Apparently, he had gotten to the trail about 2 hours after I did and hopped the fence. They never figured out the details, but he didn't even make it into the forest. When they found his body off the side of the trail, the detective on the case threw up at the scene. I didn't ask for specifics and didn't want to know. The police never tracked down those men. They took a statement from me, but I don't think I helped that much, and I never got the license plates on that car. In any case, the men had been clever enough to leave barely a trace. No DNA, no tire treads, nothing. They probably skipped town, one officer said, but the waver in his voice betrayed him. I'm not so sure either. The town did finally close the trail. They dumped a bunch of concrete over the entrances, and now the only way to get onto that 7-mile segment is by kayak. I don't think people will stay away for that long, though. Memories fade, and someday it'll just be an urban legend. You probably have a place like this near you. And it's probably in a safe town, where nothing ever happens. All I'm trying to say is this. Always look over your shoulder. And always ask yourself, is there only one way out? If you enjoyed these stories, why don't you subscribe for more? Now let's summarize them for those of us who missed out in some parts of the stories.
Let's start with the ER nurse in Willow Ridge. They're seeing these bizarre, spiral-shaped scratches on multiple patients in a very short time frame. And here's the thing. None of the patients remember how they got them.
That's really strange. And those injuries, they're not just your average scrapes and cuts, right?
Right.
They're described as incredibly precise, almost like they were made with a tool. And then the fact that nobody can recall getting injured.
Yeah, that's super weird. It's like a gap in their memory.
Exactly. A gap in their conscious experience, which is both intriguing and unsettling.
Totally. And as if that wasn't strange enough, all these patients describe this overpowering smell of rotten eggs.
Oh, that's interesting.
But here's the kicker. No one else can smell it.
You know, a rotten egg smell often indicates the presence of sulfur compounds. It makes you wonder if there's something environmental going on, something most people can't detect, but it's affecting these individuals in a strange way. Or maybe, could it be phantasmia, where people perceive phantom smells?
Oh yeah, like a hallucination, but for smell.
Exactly. But then the question is, what could be triggering this shared sensory hallucination? If that's what it is.
Right. It's like their senses are being messed with. And this nurse, they're very grounded, a total skeptic. They even took a picture of one of the wounds for the medical record and forgot to delete it, which is how they noticed the pattern. It's like even they can't ignore how weird this is.
That detail really stands out to me. This nurse is trained to observe, to document, to rely on facts.
Right. They see this stuff every day.
Yeah. And yet, they're encountering something that completely defies their medical understanding. It really makes you wonder what happens when even the professionals are faced with the inexplicable.
All right, let's move on to our second account. This one is a little darker. We're talking about an autopsy being performed on a pregnant woman found drowned in her own home, and the medical examiner knew this woman personally.
Oh, wow.
Which, just adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's a heartbreaking situation, and it definitely adds an emotional dimension to the medical examiner's observations.
Yeah.
Just imagine being in their position, trying to maintain professional objectivity while dealing with the loss of someone you knew.
I can't even imagine. And then during the autopsy, they start finding these unexplainable things. We're talking carved symbols on the woman's ribs, an empty amniotic sac, and no fetus anywhere. It's like something out of a horror movie.
Oh, wow. Those symbols, for example, they're not just random scratches, are they? They seem deliberate, almost ritualistic.
Right, like they mean something.
Yeah, in some cultures, markings like these have been associated with ancient beliefs or practices. Could there be a connection here, something we're not seeing?
Oh, totally. And then there's the missing fetus. Where did it go? How is that even possible?
It really is incredibly strange. It raises so many questions about what might have happened before this woman's death. Was there foul play involved? Or is there something else going on, something beyond our current understanding?
And as if that wasn't enough, while the medical examiner is at the morgue, they hear the sound coming from a locked supply room.
A locked supply room.
Yeah. A strange sound they can't even describe. It's like whatever is happening is starting to bleed into their reality.
That's chilling. It makes you think about hauntings or some kind of lingering presence associated with the deceased woman. The locked room, the unexplainable sound. It creates an atmosphere of mystery and dread.
Totally. It's like the line between life and death, the known and the unknown, is getting blurred. And then, get this, they go home that night and find a child's handprint on the inside of their window. Okay, how is that even possible?
That handprint is a really eerie detail.
Yeah.
It's almost like an attempt at communication, a reaching out.
From the other side.
Yeah, maybe. It connects back to the missing fetus, suggesting a link between the unborn child and these strange events. It definitely sends shivers down my spine.
Mine too. All right, so we've got these two incredibly strange accounts, both dealing with unexplainable phenomena. What do you make of it so far? Are we seeing any patterns yet?
Well, both the nurse and the medical examiner are facing situations that really challenge their worldview.
Right, like everything they thought they knew is being called into question.
Exactly. They're dealing with physical evidence that can't be easily explained away.
Yeah.
Those strange injuries, the symbols, the handprint, those are real, tangible things.
Yeah, it's not just in their heads.
Right. And they're both experiencing this underlying sense of unease, like something is lurking just beyond their perception.
It makes you think, what happens when our perception of reality is so fundamentally challenged? Do we adapt? Do we break? What happens to us?
It's a question that's fascinated philosophers and scientists for centuries. And it brings us to our final account, which takes us to this chilling, isolated canal trail. And this one is a little different. It's not about medical mysteries, but about an encounter with the unknown that leaves the witness questioning their sanity.
This one really got under my skin. We've got this runner out for their usual run on this canal trail, a place they know well. But from the very beginning, something feels off, like the whole atmosphere has changed. It's heavy with dread. And you have to remember, this town is already haunted by the story of Riley's death. Remember, the young man found dead on this very trail. Nobody knows what happened.
Yeah, the story of Riley, it's a local legend, a cautionary tale that adds an extra layer of fear to this already isolated location.
Right. It plays on our primal fears of the dark, of being alone, of being hunted. So this runner is already on edge. They feel like they're being watched, like someone is out there. And then they see him, this man just standing there on the trail, almost as if he's been waiting for them. But there's something about the way he moves, the way he looks at the runner, that just sets off alarm bells.
The runner describes his movements as being almost too deliberate, too calculated, almost like he's trying too hard to appear normal. Have you ever heard of the uncanny valley effect?
I think so, but remind me.
It's this phenomenon where something that's almost human but slightly off triggers this deep sense of unease in us, like a robot that looks a little too real.
Oh yeah, totally. It's like your brain is screaming, danger, but you can't quite explain why. And as the runner keeps going, they realize there might be someone else out there too, someone following them in the fog. They're essentially trapped on this narrow trail with nowhere to go, and that feeling of dread just keeps escalating.
I can only imagine that feeling of paranoia. Isolated, surrounded by fog, convinced that you're being followed. It's a nightmare scenario.
Totally. And that's when they make this desperate decision, jump into the freezing water of the canal.
Wow.
It's fight or flight kicking in, and they choose the only escape route they can see.
That's incredible. They were willing to risk hypothermia, even drowning, rather than face whatever was on that trail. It really speaks to the power of fear.
And then, as they're struggling in the water, they look back and see them, the men, standing on the bank just watching. But their faces, they're described as almost inhuman, contorted, twitching.
Oh, God. It's like something out of a horror movie.
Right. It's like they're wearing masks where their true nature is breaking through.
This description is just chilling.
Yeah.
It's just something beyond human comprehension, something monstrous.
Totally. It's like something out of Lovecraft. The runner manages to scramble out of the canal and into the woods, but they're freezing, disoriented, they're starting to lose feeling in their extremities.
Their body is shutting down.
Yeah. But their survival instincts are kicking in. They know they have to get to safety.
Right, every second counts.
Eventually, they stumble out onto a road, hoping to flag down a car. But guess what? There's a car already there, waiting. And it's the same car they saw earlier on the trail.
Like they can't escape. That feeling of being pursued, of being hunted. It's relentless.
And at that point, they just collapse, overcome by exhaustion and the cold. Luckily, a farmer finds them and rushes them to the hospital. They lose some fingers and toes to frostbite, but they survive. But here's where it gets even more tragic.
It's just the beginning.
The runner's friend, Gavin, also went to the canal trail that night, and he didn't come back.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Gavin's death is what makes this whole thing even more disturbing. They found him. Well, let's just say the scene was so gruesome that the detective on the case actually threw up.
That's awful.
And the police never found the men or that car. It's like they just vanished into thin air.
It's a devastating loss, and it leaves so many unanswered questions. What happened to Gavin? Who were those men? And is there any connection between their appearance on the trail and the runner's terrifying encounter?
Okay, so we've got these 3 accounts, each one weirder than the last. It's like we're putting together a puzzle, but we're missing some pieces. And the picture they're forming, whoa, it's pretty unsettling.
It is interesting you say that because each account has its own unique weirdness, right? The scratches and that phantom smell in Willow Ridge, the carvings and the missing fetus in the autopsy, and then those creepy encounters and Gavin's death on the canal trail. Either one is disturbing on its own, but when you put them all together...
It's like they're all connected somehow.
Yeah, exactly. Like different pieces of the same puzzle. It suggests a possible convergence of, well, the inexplicable.
So, is it a shared delusion?
Yep.
Or is something more tangible happening, something we just don't understand yet?
Well, a shared delusion is a possibility, but then how do you explain the physical evidence? I mean, those spiral scratches, the singles carved on the ribs, the child's handprint on the window, those are real.
Yeah, you can't just explain those away.
Exactly. That's what makes these accounts so compelling. They challenge our understanding of how the world works, you know? They force us to consider the possibility that there are forces at play that we just don't understand.
I hear you. I like to think of myself as a pretty rational person, but even I'm having trouble dismissing all of this. What if we're not really at the top of the food chain?
It's a thought that's both fascinating and terrifying at the same time, right?
Absolutely. So where does this leave us? What are we supposed to do with all of this? I mean, can we just forget about it, go back to our normal lives and pretend none of this ever happened?
I don't think forgetting is the answer. These accounts, as disturbing as they are, they offer a glimpse into just how much we don't know.
Like we're just scratching the surface.
Exactly. And I think they should inspire curiosity, a desire to explore, to ask questions, to seek answers, to confront the unknown, even if it's scary.
So what would you say is the takeaway for our listener? We've gone deep into these accounts, and honestly, we're left with more questions than answers. Is that the point?
In a way, yes. I think these stories highlight the limitations of what we know and the power of what we don't.
Yeah.
We may never have all the answers, but it's the search for those answers, the questioning, the exploration, that's where the real value lies.
That's a great point. So, to everyone listening out there, here's a final thought. What if these accounts are just the tip of the iceberg? What if there's a whole hidden world operating right under our noses? A world where the rules of reality are different, more fluid, more terrifying. What would you do if you were faced with a similar situation? Would you turn away from the inexplicable? Or would you dive deeper into the mystery? We may never have definitive answers, but that journey of exploration, that willingness to question, to consider different possibilities, is perhaps more valuable than any single answer. Keep an open mind, stay curious, and maybe, just maybe, you'll start to see the world a little differently. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.